Nearly one man dies by suicide every minute around the world, and yet this tragic fact often remains buried under the veneer of societal expectations. In the past decade, male suicide rates have soared by nearly 20% in developed nations, with men accounting for more than 3/4 of all suicides in countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom. These numbers do not appear in blockbuster headlines. Instead, they whisper through increased workplace absenteeism, rising overdose fatalities, and families left shattered by silent grief. From corporate boardrooms to suburban living rooms, from isolated military bases in remote regions to bustling city streets, the crisis manifests through the gradual dimming of countless lives. On a typical morning commute, a man may grip the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles blanch white. Yet he arrives at the office, mask in place, ready to deliver presentations, lead teams, and uphold an image of stoic strength. Behind his practiced composure, however, pulses a relentless undercurrent of dread and emptiness. At home, the pressure mounts as he juggles career ambitions with family responsibilities, attempting to be the dependable parent, the devoted partner, the reliable friend, while feeling increasingly hollow. In such moments, a man's panic manifests in untraceable anxiety that no promotion or praise can soothe. He may laugh at colleagues' jokes, contribute brilliant ideas in meetings, and volunteer for late-night projects, even as a weight of unprocessed emotion presses down on his chest. This phenomenon is not confined to any single culture or demographic. In Tokyo, middle managers quietly swallow stress that keeps them working overtime with no end in sight. In London suburbs, fathers return from the office to mute sorrow behind forced smiles at dinner tables. In rural Australian outposts, farmers carry emotional pain alone beneath rugged exteriors that have been worshipped for generations. The attributes of strength, self-sufficiency, and emotional restraint, once lauded as hallmarks of the masculine ideal, have become a prison. History echoes with parallel tragedies. After World War I, soldiers returned bearing medals of valor but internally plagued by nightmares, palpitations, and profound emotional fatigue. Psychiatrists labeled this soldier's heart, yet society continued to revere their bravery while ignoring the invisible scars. Among those therapists was Carl Jung, who witnessed how the collective shadow of a generation forced these men into roles of unyielding toughness. Fear, grief, and vulnerability were banished to the realm of cowardice, leaving countless veterans trapped in their own psyches. Today's silent epidemic mirrors that old pattern. The consequences ripple outward. Workplaces grow less empathetic, families become less connected, and communities bleed trust. The paradox lies in society praising men for denying emotional pain, while punishing them for the eventual fractures that denial inflicts. A top executive who finally admits feeling overwhelmed risks whispered rumors questioning his leadership. A respected father who seeks counseling may face whispers that he has abandoned his responsibility. The collective script demands that men internalize suffering as a testament to their character, yet this same script condemns them when suffering becomes visible. Amid this tension, a crucial insight emerges. The epidemic serves as a deep psychological signal rather than a mere statistic. It indicates that something far more profound than economic stress or genetic predisposition drives these numbers, and Jung provided the paradigm to understand it. His concept of the shadow, the hidden realm of disowned feelings and denied impulses, offers a lens through which to see why so many men find themselves on the brink. The shadow harbors the very attributes society deems incompatible with masculine strength: tenderness, vulnerability, fear, dependency. Each time a man suppresses these qualities, he consigns them to his unconscious, where they gather potency. Paradoxically, the more he denies them, the more power they wield. They erupt through panic attacks, emotional numbing, and self-destructive behaviors. No amount of professional success or social acclaim can compensate for the shadow's growing command over his inner life. Ultimately, these hidden forces shape destinies. A promising career unravels under the weight of unacknowledged grief. A loving relationship fractures when unspoken fear festers into resentment. A father's silent despair impacts children who learn that emotion equals weakness. And so the epidemic perpetuates, a sorrow passed down through generations, hidden under polished surfaces and masked by the rhetoric of masculine virtue. Yet within this crisis lies an opportunity. The same forces that drive men toward despair carry the seeds of profound transformation. Jung taught that the path to wholeness winds through the darkness of the unconscious. He insisted one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In other words, by bringing the shadow, by facing the very emotions that have been banned and buried into conscious awareness, a man can reclaim lost parts of himself, dismantle destructive patterns, and discover reservoirs of resilience and creativity. As these alarming statistics serve as a wake-up call, a deeper exploration beckons, examining how toxic masculinity operates as a projection of the shadow, and how integration of the anima, the feminine soul, can open a doorway to genuine healing. The journey begins with acknowledging the crisis, but it does not end there. From this point forward, it will be necessary to delve into Jung's shadow archetype, uncover the mechanisms of projection that fuel toxic masculinity, and explore practices for integration and vulnerability that can guide men back to life, toward a future where emotional authenticity and masculine vitality coexist in harmony. Carl Gustav Jung's concept of the shadow transformed 20th century psychology by revealing that each person harbors a hidden side filled with unacknowledged feelings, impulses, and qualities. Unlike the public persona, which conforms to societal norms and personal aspirations, the shadow consists of everything the conscious mind rejects or denies, traits deemed unacceptable, inconvenient, or simply unfamiliar. Within men, this shadow often conceals the anima, the inner feminine principle that society has traditionally banished from the masculine ideal. As a result, the shadow saturates itself with tenderness, vulnerability, fear, and other qualities that men learn to suppress. Crucially, Jung did not cast the shadow as intrinsically evil. Rather, he saw it as a dual reservoir of potential creativity and latent destructiveness. In his view, nobody becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This statement underscores that spiritual and psychological growth requires honest engagement with the parts of oneself that are hidden from view. Only by bringing repressed traits into awareness can men transform unconscious drivers into conscious assets. The shadow emerges in daily life in myriad ways. It may erupt as sudden anger when a partner expresses sensitivity, as panic attacks when success fails to fill an internal void, or as compulsive behaviors that compensate for emotional numbing. For example, a man who denies his fear of inadequacy may overwork, seeking validation through achievement, only to find that no accolade can still the persistent tremors of doubt. Similarly, a man who banishes tenderness may become dismissive of others' emotions, projecting his own need for connection onto external targets. Jung's clinical work offered vivid illustrations. He described a prominent CEO who, upon examining his dreams, encountered a wounded child calling for comfort. Initially horrified by the child's vulnerability, the CEO resisted these dream images. Yet as he persisted in dream analysis, he discovered that his relentless drive for control masked deep-seated grief over his father's neglect. By acknowledging the wounded child in his dream life, the CEO reclaimed empathy and repaired strained relationships at work. This process of shadow integration did more than heal personal wounds. It fostered creative leadership born of genuine understanding. Moreover, the shadow has collective dimensions. Societies propagate norms that define acceptable emotions and behaviors, and in doing so, relegates disapproved qualities to the shadows of millions. When entire cultures valorize toughness and self-sufficiency, masculine shadows swell with emotions that cannot be publicly expressed. This collective shadow can erupt in social crises, rising suicide rates, epidemics of substance abuse, and waves of violent outbursts, as unacknowledged feelings demand release. Within the masculine context, the anima represents the feminine archetype within the man's unconscious. When men deny their anima, they fracture their inner world. Fear becomes rage, tenderness becomes contempt, longing becomes addiction. The anima cries out through symptoms, calling for recognition. If unheeded, these cries intensify until they force a reckoning, often through breakdowns that echo tragically in suicide statistics. Jungian theory offers a path forward by prescribing specific methods to engage the shadow. First is dream analysis. By recording and reflecting on dreams, men encounter the symbolic language of the unconscious. Recurring figures, women, water, wounds, carry messages from the anima. For example, a man plagued by dreams of drowning might explore underlying fear of emotional overwhelm, thus reclaiming the anima's call for vulnerability. Second, active imagination invites awake dialogue with the shadow. In a relaxed posture, one closes the eyes and invites unconscious images to surface. Rather than suppressing them, the individual engages with these images as if interacting with another person. Questions such as, "What are you trying to show me?" or "Why have you appeared now?" allow the anima to reveal its role. Through this process, what once threatened to burst through repression becomes a conscious guide. Third, creative expression offers a hands-on approach. Painting, sculpting, dance, and poetry bypass the censor of rational thought, permitting shadow material to flow into tangible form. A man who sculpts an abstract figure may discover that the shape reflects his unspoken abandon or hidden vulnerability. Through art, he learns that the anima's voice can be heard without words, its presence felt as movement or color. Gradually, these practices dismantle the barrier between persona and shadow, restoring wholeness. Integration does not obliterate the ego, rather, it enriches it with previously denied strengths, compassion, intuition, spontaneity. A man who integrates his shadow will no longer see vulnerability as a threat, but will recognize it as a source of connection and creativity. Understanding the shadow also sheds light on toxic masculinity. By labeling anima qualities as feminine and thus improper for men, society creates a split that propels shadow projection. Men project rejected qualities onto others, condemning expressions of emotion they secretly crave. A senior engineer might scorn a team member's tears, only to reveal his own buried grief. Recognizing projection as a shadow mechanism is the first step to breaking its cycle. In sum, Jung's shadow archetype provides a powerful framework for understanding why the male mental health crisis has reached such tragic heights. It reveals that beneath statistical trends lie universal patterns of repression and denial, yet within that darkness flickers a promise that by consciously engaging the shadow, men can reclaim their full humanity. As the journey continues, it becomes vital to see how toxic masculinity functions as a projection of the shadow and how the integration of the anima toasts the way toward genuine healing. Toxic masculinity emerges as a widespread manifestation of shadow projection, in which denied qualities find expression through the vilification of others. When a man suppresses traits deemed feminine, tenderness, empathy, vulnerability, these facets of his inner life become exiled to the shadow, where they simmer and fester. Rather than integrating them, he unconsciously projects them onto the external world, labeling visible expressions of emotion in others as weakness or effeminacy. Consequently, what he most needs to reclaim in himself becomes the very attribute he most despises in his colleagues, family members, and friends. Projection operates according to a simple but powerful dynamic. A judge within the psyche accuses another of harboring the same impulses and feelings that the judge refuses to own. For example, a team leader who hides his own fear of failure might deride a junior colleague who expresses uncertainty, branding the colleague as incompetent or lazy. By displacing inner vulnerability onto an external target, the leader preserves the illusion of invulnerability. Yet this defense mechanism comes at a steep cost. Relationships fray, communication shuts down, and emotional richness escapes into exile. Culture reinforces these dynamics through social scripts and norms. Boys are taught early to man up, to never cry, and to tough it out. From playground taunts to workplace banter, any sign of emotional openness can trigger swift ridicule. When a young man shows tears, his peers might jeer, "Did you lose your teddy bear?" While intended as harmless teasing, such ridicule deepens the taboo on feelings, ensuring that emotions migrate beneath the threshold of consciousness. As these unacknowledged feelings accumulate, they grow into a collective shadow that lurks beneath the facade of every man who has learned to distrust his own heart. At work, toxic masculinity often appears as overreach, dominating discussions, ignoring feedback, and shaming colleagues who admit stress or doubt. For example, during a project debrief, a manager might scold a team member for looking too stressed, suggesting a lack of commitment rather than acknowledging the genuine struggles of balancing workload and personal life. This reaction reflects the manager's own repressed anxiety, an anxiety he cannot afford to acknowledge lest it threaten his constructed image of control. Toxic masculinity also breeds isolation. Men who internalize projection defenses become less willing to share burdens, lest their hidden vulnerabilities become exposed. emotional support networks weaken as each man assumes he must cope alone. Without genuine connection, loneliness deepens, and the protective barrier of denial grows more brittle. Ultimately, the absence of open emotional expression increases distress, fueling the very mental health crisis that toxic masculinity claims to guard against. Homes become battlegrounds for projection as well. When a father condemns his child's emotional outbursts with dismissive phrases like "big boys don't cry," he not only silences the child but reinforces his own exile of sensitivity. His child learns to suppress discomfort, perpetuating a cycle that echoes across generations. Consequently, children inherit a version of masculinity that equates emotional expression with shame, embedding the projection dynamic into their developing psyches. Academic research underscores these observations. Studies show that men who strongly adhere to traditional masculine norms are significantly more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. They report fewer healthy coping strategies and exhibit higher levels of self-criticism. In other words, toxic masculinity exacts a heavy toll on mental health. Projection compounds these issues by diverting attention from the root causes, unprocessed emotions, into blame and judgment of others. Breaking the cycle of toxic masculinity therefore requires interrupting projection at its source. Men must first recognize projection as a defensive posture rather than an objective truth. When a surge of anger or contempt arises in response to another's vulnerability, it signals the presence of repressed material within. By pausing and reflecting, what am I reacting to in myself? The projection becomes an invitation to self-inquiry rather than an opportunity for judgment. For example, if witnessing a co-worker's tears provokes disdain, the man might quietly name the emotion. I feel discomfort around vulnerability, and trace it back to personal history. Perhaps a childhood experience taught that tears equated to weakness or invited rejection. Bringing awareness to this inner wound transforms the moment of projection into a moment of possibility. The man shifts from adversary to ally, turning judgment into curiosity. What part of me longs to feel what I am condemning? This interruption of projection opens the doorway to empathy. By acknowledging that the critic within is driven by fear and pain, a man can extend compassion to both himself and the person he once scorned. Empathy thus becomes the antidote to toxic projection, dissolving the US versus them mentality that fuels divisiveness. Furthermore, group settings can accelerate this transformation. Men's circles, support groups, and workshops create environments where projection is gently reflected back by peers. When one man expresses discomfort, others share parallel stories, revealing the universality of hidden struggles. This collective resonance diminishes shame and validates vulnerability. What began as an instance of projection becomes a moment of shared humanity. Ultimately, dismantling toxic masculinity does not demand the abandonment of healthy masculine traits, courage, responsibility, resilience, but requires expanding the definition of strength to include emotional authenticity. True resilience flourishes not in stiff upper lips, but in the capacity to experience fear, grief, and longing without being overwhelmed. As projection gives way to integration, the qualities of the anima, intuition, empathy, receptivity, enrich the masculine psyche. The result is a balanced synthesis, a man who stands firm in action, yet remains open in feeling. Thus, toxic masculinity reveals itself as a symptom of shadow projection, a coping strategy that protects the ego at the expense of connection, creativity, and genuine well-being. By recognizing projection's workings, men reclaim the parts of themselves that projection occludes. This reclamation fuels personal growth and begins to heal the broader mental health crisis, one consciousness at a time. Jung asserted that the pathway to wholeness lies in reclaiming the anima, the inner feminine force exiled within the masculine psyche. Integration begins with acknowledging that the anima is not an alien intruder but a vital expression of emotional depth, intuition, and creativity. Through dream work, active imagination, and creative expression, men can forge a dialogue with this hidden aspect, transforming suppressed energy into a source of vitality. Dream work invites men to record their nocturnal visions immediately upon awakening, capturing symbols and scenarios often dismissed as mere fantasy. Over weeks, a pattern may emerge, water imagery suggesting emotional overwhelm, or recurring figures of women embodying guidance or conflict. Jung believed that dreams are the guiding words of the soul, and by honoring their messages without censorship, the dreamer begins to integrate the anima. For example, a banker plagued by dreams of a stern mother towering over him discovered that he had long denied his need for nurturing. By embracing this insight, he began practicing self-care routines he had once scorned, balancing his relentless work ethic with compassionate rest. Active imagination builds on dream material during waking life. In a quiet room, the man closes his eyes and invites inner figures to appear. He may perceive a pale woman speaking in riddles or a child weeping silently. Instead of banishing these presences, he engages them in conversation. What is your purpose? What do you seek from me? Through this dialogue, the anima reveals her role, calling for emotional responsiveness, guiding toward creativity, or exposing neglected wounds. Afterward, the man records the exchange, noting phrases, emotions, and even ambient sensations. This practice dissolves the barrier between conscious intent and unconscious wisdom, allowing the anima's gifts to inform daily choices. Creative expression offers a third avenue for integration. When words fall short, art becomes a conduit for shadow material. Painting abstract forms, sculpting with clay, or improvising movement in dance bypasses the critical mind, granting the anima voice through form, color, and rhythm. A marketing director who once laughed at expressive arts found himself drenched in sweat during an unstructured dance workshop. Afterward, he felt both exposed and enlivened. His awkward movements had embodied a hidden yearning for unrestrained joy. Similarly, a surgeon who sketched surreal landscapes in charcoal unearthed deep layers of suppressed grief and longing. Discovering that his steady hands could create rather than only heal, through art, the anima's presence blossoms, enriching the masculine spirit with spontaneity and emotional resonance. Central to these methods is consistent practice. Integration does not occur in a single session. It unfolds in incremental steps as men cultivate curiosity and patience. The nightly ritual of dream journaling, the weekly commitment to active imagination, and occasional creative workshops weave a tapestry of growing self-awareness. Over months, the accumulated insights shift subconscious patterns. What once triggered panic now invites reflection. What once provoked contempt now elicits compassion. Group settings can amplify integration. In men's circles, participants share dream accounts and exchange guided active imagination exercises. Witnessing peers engage tenderly with their anima fosters a sense of shared journey, reducing shame and isolation. Creative arts sessions led by therapists allow men to experiment with expression in a supportive environment, receiving gentle feedback that reinforces the anima's legitimacy. These communal rituals transform solitary practices into collective milestones, cementing the anima's place within the group psyche. Scholars and therapists emphasize the importance of balancing integration with grounded living. As the anima emerges, men may experience surges of emotion or creativity that feel destabilizing. Without an anchor, they risk becoming overwhelmed. Therefore, practices such as mindfulness meditation, grounding exercises in nature, and structured physical activity provide stability. For example, a teacher undergoing active imagination retreats complemented his inner work with daily hikes in the woods, grounding the anima's intensity in the solidity of earth and sky. Dreams also call for contextual integration. An engineer who dreamt of a crumbling tower and a comforting female figure interpreted the tower as his collapsing work identity. Rather than abandoning his career, he amended it, delegating more tasks and nurturing collaborative relationships he had neglected. The comforting figure symbolized his anima's call for emotional connection. By initiating weekly check-ins with colleagues, he honored that call without sacrificing professional integrity. Thus, the anima's guidance becomes practical action. As the anima integrates formerly denounced qualities, empathy, receptivity, imaginative insight begin to shine in daily life. In meetings, a leader listens for the unspoken needs of his team. At home, a father embraces playfulness with his children rather than rushing through routines. In private moments, a man permits tears without fear of diminished masculinity. The anima no longer lurks in the shadows but walks beside him as an ally, enriching his decisions with emotional intelligence. Moreover, integrating the anima fosters healthier relationships. When men accept vulnerability within, they mirror that acceptance outward, inviting partners and children to express feelings without judgment. A husband who once scorned his wife's tears, now offers tissue and presence, strengthening emotional intimacy. A friend moved by his own rediscovered tenderness becomes a compassionate listener, deepening bonds that had grown superficial. Ultimately, anima integration transforms toxic suppression into dynamic wholeness. What once seemed incompatible with masculine identity, sensitivity, receptivity, intuition, becomes a source of power. Men find they can stand firm in action while remaining open in feeling, balancing decisive leadership with empathetic understanding. Jung described this union as individuation, the emergence of a fully integrated self where persona and shadow dance in harmony. In this light, the mental health crisis becomes a gateway rather than a dead end. By engaging the anima through dreams, imagination, and creative expression, women's qualities once repressed within men animate a richer, more fulfilling life. As the anima breathes through conscious practice, men step out of the shadows into the full spectrum of their humanity, grounded in purpose and enlivened by authentic connection, drawing together the insights of the shadow, projection, and anima integration. A tangible turning point arises through deliberate vulnerability practice, an embodied invitation for men to step from the shadow's grip into conscious wholeness. Rather than perceiving vulnerability as weakness, this practice reframes it as a strategic act of courage, mapping a pathway from silent suffering toward resilience and authentic connection. Vulnerability practice begins each day with a simple ritual of self-attunement. Before the mind races into schedules and responsibilities, the man pauses for 3 deliberate breaths. On the first inhale, he acknowledges the presence of emotion, whether it flickers as anxiety, dread, fatigue, or longing. On the exhale, he names the emotion aloud or in a quiet whisper. I feel tension, or I feel fear. This act of naming, practiced daily, imprints a new neural pattern. The shadowed emotion, once banished to unconscious exile, now receives conscious recognition. Over time, this morning pause becomes a secure base from which deeper vulnerability takes root. For example, at midday, a brief vulnerability check offers another opportunity. Stepping away from the computer, the man finds a private space, a restroom stall, an empty conference room, or even his car. There, for 1 minute, he directs attention inward, scanning for tightness or resistance within the body. If he detects a lump in the throat or a constricted chest, he places a hand over the area and breathes into it, reminding himself, it's safe to feel. This practice not only interrupts habitual defenses, but also models for the nervous system that emotional expression does not portend danger. In parallel, weekly guided sessions deepen the work, whether in a men's circle, therapeutic group, or virtual workshop. Participants gather to share experiences and practice vulnerability in community. A typical session might begin with check-ins. Each man names one moment from his week when emotions surfaced: joy at a child's laughter, grief at a loss, or irritation at an unresolved conflict. Sharing these moments demands presence and honesty, as each man sits with the discomfort of both speaking and listening. As each story unfolds, the group responds not with solutions but with empathetic silence and reflective questions such as, what did it feel like to allow that moment? Or how did your body respond? These questions hone interoceptive awareness, guiding participants from head-centric rationalizing to embodied feeling. For example, one participant recounts feeling a sudden wave of shame after missing a project deadline. As he articulates this feeling, his peers reflect back observations. They notice his shoulders slump and voice quiver, encouraging him to describe the physical sensation. Through this process, the man discovers that beneath shame lies a fear of inadequacy that echoes childhood messages of not being good enough. The group's non-judgmental presence provides a container for this realization, making the shadow material less threatening and more graspable. Creative vulnerability exercises also play a critical role. One powerful practice, adapted from Jungian art therapy, invites participants to choose a color that represents a suppressed emotion: blue for sorrow, red for rage, yellow for longing, and to paint a spontaneous stroke within a structured framework, such as a circle divided into quadrants. The directive emphasizes process over product. Strokes may overlap, or drips may form, and every mark constitutes valid expression. As paint meets paper, participants often experience release, a visceral acknowledgement of feelings not previously permitted. Following the paint session, sharing reflections on color choice, stroke quality, and bodily sensations fosters communal integration, reinforcing that vulnerability exercises nurture rather than diminish masculine identity. A complementary practice involves bodily witnessing, often paired with partner work. In this exercise, one man closes his eyes and listens to a brief recorded poem or statement about vulnerability, such as David Whyte's reflections on courage. As he absorbs the words, he notices the body's reactions, tightness around the heart, a tremor in the stomach, and remains fully present. His partner, in silent vigilance, observes and later gently describes visible changes. "I noticed your breath shortened when you heard to risk falling into the unknown." This external witnessing affords the speaker both the permission to feel and the clarity of another's empathetic gaze, reinforcing that vulnerability is safe and supported. Underlying these varied practices is the principle of graduated exposure. Just as a diver descends gradually into deeper water to acclimate to pressure, men can approach emotional depths in staged encounters, morning pauses, midday checks, weekly group sessions, and creative workshops, rather than plunging unprepared into overwhelming experiences. This structured approach respects individual boundaries while steadily expanding capacity. Much like physical training builds strength through incremental challenges, as vulnerability practice matures, its fruits extend into everyday life. A manager, once stiff at his team's displays of stress, now listens actively when a junior member falters, offering a moment of compassion rather than a reprimand. A father, accustomed to emotional stoicism, now sheds tears alongside his child's struggles, modeling that strong men can cry too. A friend, once awkward in the face of confessions, now holds space without advice, affirming that presence itself is a profound gift. Sustaining vulnerability practice calls for community and ongoing resources. Men's groups often provide newsletters, podcasts, and online forums where participants can share insights, challenges, and victories. Recommended reading includes James Hollis's Explorations of Adult Development, Esther Harding's Compassionate Mapping of the Anima, and Jung's own essays on individuation. Online platforms offer guided meditations and creative prompts that men can access between sessions, keeping the embers of vulnerability glowing. Importantly, these practices converge in one vital principle. Vulnerability liberates rather than cripples. By daring to face inner discomfort, men reclaim agency over their emotional lives. They dissolve the sharp edges of toxic projection, integrate the anima's gifts, and realign with a more nuanced, resilient form of masculinity. Through vulnerability, the hidden storm within finds a path toward expression, no longer raging ungoverned in silent isolation. Finally, the call to action emerges naturally from this mosaic of practice. Each man is invited to begin his vulnerability journey today, to pause for 3 breaths in the morning, to perform a midday check, to seek out a supportive circle, and to explore creative expression that speaks his shadow language. By taking these steps, he not only transforms his own life, but also contributes to healing communities, workplaces, and families. In reclaiming vulnerability, men break the silent epidemic of suffering and light the way toward a future where emotional courage stands proudly alongside traditional strength.